My name is Sturm Becko. I'm a postdoc at the Juhász Rabinowitz Center. I'm excited to be chairing this session. So, this is a conference about macroeconomics, or excuse me, macrofinance in the long run, and specifically this session's about supply-side macro policy. So I'd like to cue things up by just sort of highlighting a broad trend over the last 20 years, of which probably everyone in the audience is aware, and that's low investment in the US. So, on the private side, we've seen sort of anemic levels of US investment relative to profitability and the cost of capital. So, in a period where we might have expected an investment boom, given low interest rates, we haven't seen that. This is also a public phenomenon where public investment as a share of GDP has been declining since the 60s and continued through the recent period. So, in this setting, it's natural to ask, are these trends going to continue? Why is it that firms are sort of investing at this low rate? And what do we know about what governments are doing or what governments could be doing? So the good things for me is that I get to ask these questions and hand things off to our great set of panelists who are really at the forefront of research in these areas. So we're going to start with Joe Hazell from the London School of Economics, who's going to tell us a bit about what interest rates are doing in the long run. Then we're going to have Kilian from the University of Chicago, who's going to tell us about how we can think maybe about these firm investment trends. And then finally, Réka Juhász from the University of British Columbia is going to tell us what we sort of know about supply-side macro policy through the lens of industrial policy. So they're each going to talk for 15 or 20 minutes. Then we're going to have a short panel discussion and then open things up.
So thanks so much for having me at this wonderful conference. So thank you for the invitation. I'm going to talk to you today about some research that I've been doing with Artif and with Veronica, who's also in the audience. It's a paper called Dynamics of the Long-Term Housing Yield, Evidence from Natural Experiments. This paper is about measuring the expected long-term yield of housing. What is the expected long-term yield of housing? Well, the yield is the rent-price ratio of housing. So here I've written it. I've written this object Y star. It's the rent-price ratio, RT over PT, that is expected in the long run. And another way you can write this long-term yield Y star as the sum of three terms. R star, the long-run risk-free rate. This is an object of key interest to policy that I'll talk quite a bit about. Zeta star, the long-run housing risk premium. And G star, the long-run capital gain. Why do we care about this object Y star? Because it measures expectations about the long-run structure of the economy. We can ask important questions, for instance, have long-run expectations changed recently? Or is the market still pricing things like secular stagnation in the long run? Does the market still think that in the long run, we're going to return to this pre-2020 world of relatively low yields and high valuations? So Y star seems like an important object to measure, but it's also hard to measure. Valuations are affected by shorter-term shocks. Good. Great, excellent. But Y star is also hard to measure. Why? Because valuations are affected by shorter-term shocks. Prominently right now, monetary policy is one of those shocks. The service flow of housing is often hard to observe. For instance, owner-occupied housing, it's a little bit difficult to know what determines the cash flows coming out of owner-occupied housing. What we discovered, what Artif, Veronica, and I discovered, is a natural experiment from the UK property market. There exist in the UK very long-duration leases, so in excess of 70 years, that sort of quasi-randomly extend their lease duration by another 90 years. So we brought together some new administrative data on around 150,000 of these lease extension experiments. And what we study in this paper is the price change before versus after extension for the same property. As I'll tell you a bit about, this is going to be able to measure Y star for UK property at very long-term horizons. One thing that we really want to emphasize today is that we've made the data public. The Y star series is updated in real time, so hopefully if I can persuade you it's useful, it's something that some of you in the room might go away and work with yourselves. Two results, very briefly. Y star for UK property fell from 5.2% to 3.0% from 2000 to 2020. These are big numbers, as I'll explain. Moreover, Y star has been stable from 2020 to present. And this is something we're constructing in real time. We're updating monthly. Why should you care? I think at least two reasons. So first, our estimates are going to suggest that the sort of all-important long-term return on safe assets, R star, has not risen from 2020 to present. And secondly, the large decline in Y star that we saw prior to 2020 suggests an inelastic long-run supply of housing. So coming back to the themes that John was mentioning, at least for housing, a crucial part of the economy, inelastic housing supply is one of the key determinants of long-run movements in asset prices. So let me dive in by explaining what the natural experiment is And it relies on this peculiar British institution known as leaseholds. In the United States, typically when you sign a lease with a property, it's a lease for 1, maybe 2 years. In the UK, it's rather different. You can sign a lease that's in excess of 70 years. This is very common. You sign a lease with the underlying owner of the property, known as a freeholder. And this lease, because it's very long duration, it's also freely tradable. So as with many things in the UK, this is a system that was originally set up to benefit the aristocracy. So it was designed to give liquidity to cash-poor aristocrats. The idea here is if you're an aristocrat, you own all this land, you don't want to surrender the political entitlement that that land gives you, but you do want to make some cash out of it. You sign these very long-term leases in order to make money off the land without having to manage it. So originally, that's the idiosyncratic reason why it happened in the UK, but it's very common. So all apartments, and therefore around a quarter of all dwellings in the UK, are leaseholds. What's important for our purposes is that leaseholders are entitled to extend the lease by 90 years by paying the freeholder the present value of the lease extension. So let me give you a brief schematic. A brief schematic that sort of shows you how this works. So imagine that I'm a property purchaser. So at some time t minus h, I buy a property at price p t minus h. And it has some initial duration, capital T plus h. So that's the number of years left on this very long-term lease. Then a few years later, so I think in this example, u years later, I decide to extend this lease. I extend it by 90 years. And then a few years later after that, I sell the property. I sell the property at price pt. But now it has a longer sale duration. It doesn't have a sale duration of t. It has a sale duration of capital T plus 90. That's the extension. So the extension is extending the duration of this lease. Why is this useful? So this is obviously something we delve into great detail in the paper. But conceptually, the price change before versus after lease extension, so I guess pt minus h, is going to be very informative about Y star, what I'm calling the expected long-term yield of housing. Why is that? Well, conceptually, you can think about the price before extension as capitalizing the short-term value of property. You know, the flows, the rents over the remaining 70 years that the property has left. After you extend, the price after extension is capitalizing both that shorter-term value and also longer-term value, the new 90 years additional of rents and cash flows coming out of the property. Then if I take the difference between the price before versus the price after extension, what I'm left with is only the long-term value. And that long-term value is something that with a little bit of work one can show identifies this long-term valuation, this long-term expected housing yield, Y star. So that's the natural experiment. And then what we do is we put it to work to say, well, what's going on with Y star? What's going on with this expected long-term housing yield? And here's the first result that we found very striking, which is the trend dynamics of Y star, and in particular, a big fall over our sample period. So that's what I'm plotting here. Got Y star on the x-axis. It starts at about 5%. It falls all the way to a little bit less than 2%. So before the Great Recession, it's quite stable. And then you see this fairly steady decline over the rest of the sample period, over the subsequent 15 years. So to give some context to the magnitude of these numbers, we're starting at around 5.2%. We're ending at around 2.8%. So this is near a doubling of the price-rent ratio. So these are fairly big numbers. The other thing that I sort of want to center is that this is not for government bond yields, but for housing. So by now, there's a tremendous amount of work showing that expected long-term yields in government bonds have been falling rapidly, maybe not rapidly, falling steadily over the last decades. But what there's been less work on is showing that these yields may have been falling for other forms of capital out there in the real economy. And housing being a very important form of capital, we're showing that long-term yields have fallen there too. One thing that's sort of nice to notice, and something I'll mention more about, these gray bars are sort of the uncertainty associated with our estimates. And in fact, there's relatively little uncertainty. So we can sort of make this claim about a large decline with great confidence. So that's the first one, the first result, a big secular decline. The second result is about the real-time dynamics of Y star. So here we're exploiting the fact that we have a lot of data. We have 900 lease extensions every month. We have a lot of cross-sectional variation. So even at a given point in time, even in a given month, we can estimate this object Y star. So we can kind of create a real-time indicator that we hope can be useful for policymakers, for academics like ourselves, and so on. So we're constructing this object every month. And I'm plotting it here. So on the left axis, I have Y star. I'm starting in 2016, all the way through to October 2023, so virtually the present day. Because we can do that, the The data are publicly available. They are updated extremely frequently. So this measure y star, hovers within quite a stable band. So it starts a little bit less than 4%, and it ends a little bit more than 2%. So it's very stable. And why is this interesting? Well, over this period, there have been at least two very large, but arguably transitory shocks. The first was the pandemic. So in 2020 through to 2022, there's this big, but perhaps from markets perceived to be transitory shock, which is the pandemic. And indeed, you can see that our measure that's supposed to look through short-term shocks and only look into the medium and long term, indeed, our measure doesn't respond very much to the pandemic shock. The second interesting real-time shock is, of course, the rising shorter-term yields that we've seen around the world, perhaps associated with monetary policy. And so to make that point, what we've plotted on the right axis is the 10-year, 20-year real forward rate on UK government bonds. So what's that? That's in the UK how markets expect interest rates, real interest rates, are going to evolve in the medium term. And what you can see again from the right axis and the dashed line is that in the UK, as in much of the world, these interest rates have risen quite sharply from 2022 to 2024. Now, potentially this is associated with a transitory monetary tightening. And indeed, our measure of the long-term yield that's sort of supposed to look through these transitory effects remains relatively stable. So let me tell you two implications of our estimates. The first is implications of the long-term housing yield for sort of the all-important object R star, the long-run rate of return on safe assets. Now, one question that's been hotly debated, including by people in this room, is whether or not the long-run rate of return R star has risen after 2020. This matters for many things. I think it needs a little justification. But for instance, for the stance of monetary policy, the value of R star tells you if your interest rate today is contractionary or expansionary. And maybe more broadly, one can use R star as one diagnostic to understand if we're back in this pre-2020 world or if we've moved to a new normal. But unfortunately, R star is elusive. R star is very difficult to measure. Existing structural estimates disagree. They're difficult to interpret, because ultimately these structural estimates rely on a specific model. And of course, it's very hard to get the model of the economy exactly right. We're not exactly estimating R star, but we're estimating something that has a great degree of information about R star. And you'll recall from the introduction that our measure Y star, the expected long-term housing yield, is the sum of three components: risk premium, R star, and capital gains. Now, the fact that we're finding Y star is very stable strongly suggests that R star didn't rise. Other benefits is that we have these quite precise estimates, and arguably we're making few assumptions to learn about R star because we're relying heavily on the benefits of the natural experiment. So that's the first implication for R star. The second is about long-run supply, which really comes into the key themes of this conference. What we find here is that regional Y star falls by more in regions with inelastic housing supply. That's what this graph is showing here. So on the y-axis, I'm calculating Y star, this expected long-term yield on housing. I'm calculating it region by region. So for the UK equivalent of counties in the United States. Then I'm plotting the peak to trough decline. So from 2003, when the data starts, through to 2020, which is roughly the trough. And you can see basically for all regions, from the negative values of the left-hand side, there's a decline. But what's interesting to us is on the x-axis, we plot a proxy for how inelastic supply is in every region. So our proxy is the refusal rate, to what extent councils decline planning permissions within each region. What you can see is that here on the far right-hand side, the most inelastic regions, so the places where there is the most declining of building by councils, one has a much larger decline in Y star compared with the left-hand side. So these are regions with relatively elastic supply, where the existing building structures, the existing building and planning permission is relatively permissive. So again, at a regional level, what we're seeing is that areas with elastic housing supply have relatively small declines in Y star, Areas with relatively inelastic housing supply have much larger declines. Now, what we take from this sort of cross-sectional information is that in aggregate, the fact that we've seen a large decline in Y star overall suggests that in aggregate, UK housing supply is inelastic. Now, to some extent, this is well known. Those of you even who aren't British will be aware that the UK is sort of well known for inelastic housing supply. But what we think here is important is that we're showing that this inelasticity lasts even through to the long run, because after all, these are long-run measures, not just of the short run, but of the expected long-run evolution of asset prices. One thing that we're sort of building on in future work is trying to understand, linking asset yields to the inelasticity of asset supply here with housing is something that could be done to understand some of the patterns more broadly that John's been talking about. So those are the lessons that I wanted you to take away from this paper. And again, what did we do? We found this, we think, cool natural experiment to estimate long-term housing yields. And there were 4 takeaways from doing so. First, that Y star fell quite significantly from before the Great Recession through to now. Secondly, that it's been stable before, during, and after the pandemic. Thirdly, this has implications for R star, so the current debate. We think our estimates suggest R star is unlikely to have risen. And finally, movements in Y star can be informative about the elasticity of housing supply, about an informative diagnostic about the kinds of issues that this conference is really about discussing. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you to Artif and the organizers for including us on the program. This is based on joint work with myself, Fukui, who's at Boston University, and my colleague Niels Gormsen, who's also at the University of Chicago. I'll be talking about how changes in interest rates affect investment, and in particular, I'll be thinking about how firm discount rates respond to changes in interest rates. So let's start by talking about the textbook and reality. So there's a textbook view that's in the back of all of our minds when we think about interest rates and investment, and that view is that firms invest if the expected return to a project exceeds some kind of threshold, hurdle rate, cutoff rate. That rate I'm going to call discount rate for now, and that's the required return. So if firms expect to make a certain percent on a project, and if that percentage exceeds what they call their discount rate, they're going to do it. So say Princeton, maybe it wants to invest in new microphones, thinks about what's the return to that going to be. Maybe it's going to give us a 6% return. Maybe the cost of capital is only 4%. We're paying 4% interest rates. Let's do it. But if we're paying 20% interest rates, maybe it's not worth investing into these microphones. And we know interest rates will be going up, so maybe that's the reason for some of the investment decisions. Now, what should that discount rate be? Well, in the textbook, it should be something called the cost of capital. If you think of a simple example, that's just the interest rate in a very simple model. You borrow at an interest rate of 4%. That's your cost of capital. In the real world, it's a bit more complicated. There's different types of assets. There's equity and so on. So then you want to think about other types of financial returns as well. But for today, just kind of assume there's a world with only the interest rate, and that determines the cost of capital. So this is very intuitive. You invest if your return is bigger than the cost. If interest rates go down, you invest more. Interest rates have been falling in the long run for a long time, so we should have seen an investment boom. And in policy, in academia, and the real world, this kind of view is very prevalent, sort of shapes our thinking about what interest rates should do to investment. But do firms actually do this? And should we care? Should we care about how firms implement the textbook worldview? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. One unfortunate thing is that we don't really know very well how firms make these internal decisions so far. We really have no data over time measuring how firms calculate what their cost of capital is or how they perceive financial market movements. And then we have little data over time tracking how different firms change their discount rates or these required returns over time. And if you want to understand how changes in interest rates affect firms' internal investment behavior, we really want to get to this kind of dynamic data. There's some evidence, important big names have worked on this question before. There's some evidence that firms don't literally follow the textbook because these discount rates on average are higher than what interest rates and the cost of capital would suggest. But again, we lack the idea of what happens over time and if they incorporate changes over time well. So today I'll talk about some measurement that we've done to try and inform our review of what firms actually do, how they set their discount rates. And then I'll have 3 conceptual implications of the measurement. First, I'll show that the way firms have set discount rates has diverged from what interest rates have done, and we think that can account in important ways for what investment has done in the last 20 years, especially why investment has been so low. Then I'll talk a bit more about the short-run implication of this behavior. So what does the fact that firms are doing something different with their discount rates, what does that mean for monetary policy, fiscal policy? And I'll argue that there's some interesting implications. For example, that there's a new way that Fed actions can actually matter for firm investment through this kind of behavior. And finally, I'll talk at the end about how firms think about financial markets, how they think about interest rates and the cost of capital, and I'll show you some evidence that there's a lot of dispersion. Firms get this wrong all the time, and that leads to misallocation in the economy. OK, let's go. What do? Well, we measure, first of all, firm discount rates and perceived cost of capital from conference calls. Now, it turns out that many large corporations tell us exactly what they think the cost of capital is and what they use as discount rates or hurdle rates on conference calls that they hold on a quarterly basis with investors. So this is a well-known firm, Intuit. It's a NASDAQ 100, S&P 500 firm. And this is a quote from the CFO on one of their calls. And they say, we're going to keep investing in opportunities that give us a 15% plus rate of return our internal rate of return, hurdle rate, is 15%. And then he also says our weighted average cost of capital, so that's kind of his interpretation of their cost of funding, is between 9 or 9.5%. So from this type of transcript, we get that they think the perceived cost of capital, their cost of funding, is between 9 to 9.5%, and that the minimum return that they're willing to accept on projects is 15%. So any project that they think will yield more than 15%, they're going to do. And we do this on a large scale. We've read by now 110,000 paragraphs with a large team of RAs. It's been sort of a 3-year effort. These conference calls are relatively high-stakes settings that firms get pushed. We can verify if what they say actually makes sense, and we think that we get some useful numbers for how firms actually implement their investment decisions and think about setting these required returns. So what can we learn from these numbers? Well, first of all, here's just a picture of the raw data for US firms over time. So we see a familiar trend in the green and red lines, which is interest rates have been declining over the last 20 years, and firms have picked up on that. So what they say their cost of capital is, what they say their interest rates are, kind of mirrors what financial economists would say when they calculate simple models. There's a downward trend, and that trend has been pretty secular, interrupted by the financial crisis over the last 20 years. And remember now, the textbook model, we think that firms should adopt this red line, the cost of capital, as their cutoff rate, because if they're paying 10% for their funding, they should take all projects that give them more than 10%. But in fact, the required returns that they have are much higher, so they on average take fewer projects, but also they behave very differently. They have a life of their own relative to the cost of capital. So on average, they're kind of stable, but they jump around a lot. When times are bad, such as in the financial crisis, they actually go up by quite a bit. But there's really no evidence that even after the crisis, when rates have been dropping, firms have accommodated this and lowered their discount rates. So that means they have a higher threshold than what financial markets imply for investment, which means they're investing less. So you can already see where this is going. So now we calculate the difference between what firms' discount rates are and what the cost of capital is. And again, that should be flat, because in the textbook, firms just follow the cost of capital when they set their discount rates. In fact, it's very much not flat. You can see it goes up during the crisis. That's because firms are raising these discount rates by a lot when things are going badly. They're more conservative in investing. It goes a bit down again, and then as rates have been falling, but discount rates have remained flat, this wedge opens up. So since 2010, this is kind of flat, this is going down, and that gives you an increasing wedge. And the numbers here are really big, right? So you can compare this to different types of financial phenomena we've seen over the last 20 years. QE, for example, or declines in the natural rate, which is something that Joe just talked about, those often hover around 1 percentage point or less. Here, the change is around 2 percentage points in the last 10 to 15 years. So these are really big numbers that firms are sort of imposing on themselves and hindering their investment with. Now, the standard view of how interest rates should have affected investment is interest rates down, firms get this, their cost of capital goes down, they then follow mechanically with their discount rates, and that raises investment, right? The reality is we've seen a huge capital shortfall, less investment than there should have been, and there's different ways to show this. Here I'm basically replicating Gutierrez and Philippon, who show that if you look at a simple model, the Q model, and you think about what should investment have been, and then you calculate what investment actually was, then we're sort of 20 to 25% short overall. So these are really big numbers, right? Now, our approach to this is going to be, say we tweak the model a little bit. Say we realize that firms actually don't follow interest rates when they set their required returns, but they do their own thing, so they're much more stable. What would that imply? And what we find is that this increasing wedge, so the stable, relatively sticky discount rates, they account for a large share of this missing investment. You repeat this exercise, but now you don't feed in the interest rate, but you feed in the firm's required return that we've measured on these calls. You get that a large share of the missing investment is explained by this. So that means if you want to understand why firms have been investing less than we think they should have, we probably want to look inside the firm and think about why are they setting discount rates this way. Now, there's other stories out there. For example, maybe we're just mismeasuring capital, or maybe there's just no more good projects. We've run out of good ideas. Now, this figure is not to say that these stories don't play a role, but it also suggests that to a large extent what's going on is something else, which is that firms internally are more conservative than what interest rates imply in their investment. And that's something that we think is worth thinking about more. We're in the middle of trying to understand this phenomenon better. We have some evidence that firms in more competitive markets do more what the textbook says. So if you're in a very competitive market in 2000, you have a lot of other firms trying to compete for market share, then you're more likely to invest more likely to lower your discount rates with interest rates. And there's maybe some interesting policy implications that will come out of this. Very good. So that's the first part. I want to talk about long-run investment and discount rates. Now I want to talk a bit about the business cycle implications, the supply side and investment during business cycles and what we can learn about firm behavior from the fact that they set their discount rates differently to what the textbook says. So here's just a picture to motivate this. Firms rarely change their discount rates. So the nominal discount rate is pretty constant over time. Even 10 years out, about 40% still have the same discount rate, right? So this makes little sense in the textbook because interest rates are changing all the time, and you can see firms are actually adjusting their perceived cost of capital all the time. But nominal discount rates are relatively sticky. So what does that mean for firm investment over the business cycle? Here's a concrete example from a very interesting business cycle that we've just seen, COVID and expected inflation going up after COVID. So green is a measure of expected inflation on financial markets, and you can see, as we all know, that has been going up in the wake of the COVID recession. Firms understand that inflation is going up because they're increasing their perceived cost of capital, so their measure of their funding cost, quantitatively similar to the increase in expected inflation, although with a bit of a lag. So they kind of get it, but they need a couple of quarters to pick up on that. But what they're not doing is changing their nominal discount rates in line with them. Again, textbook suggests red line and blue line should be the same number, but they're clearly not. Discount rates are relatively stable. And this is a phenomenon that we call sticky discount rates. So discount rates don't respond to expected inflation, and you can probably see the analogy to sticky wages, right? So wages are often sticky nominally, and here we say that within the firm there's also this sticky object, sticky discount rate. Okay, so who cares? What we really care about is real quantities, right? We care about real investment. We don't care about some nominal amount in dollars. We care about how many machines and factories and microphones are actually being invested in. So we care about real discount rates, and those are simply just the difference between the nominal discount rates and the real discount rates. So if the nominal discount rate changes by a certain amount, well, if it's all driven by inflation, that doesn't really change the real amount of investment we're going to get. But what I've just told you is that nominal discount rates don't change very much. So imagine a firm that doesn't change their nominal discount rate at all. Well, that means the real discount rate is now just the negative of the change in inflation, right? So if nominal discount rates are sticky, if they don't change, inflation directly affects real discount rates. So inflation goes up, real discount rates goes down, and if real discount rates go down, then firms have a lower real hurdle to invest. They're probably going to be investing more. And we, in fact, find evidence for this in the data. So in times of high inflation, such as recently, in the past few years, firms that have maintained sticky, unchanged nominal discount rates have been investing more. So now you get a deviation from the textbook model in the sense that inflation directly feeds into real investment. So anything that the government does to change inflation may also have an interesting impact on investment that we haven't thought about before. Now, of course, this is not the only thing that changes when inflation goes up. We may also have uncertainty and other phenomena that may harm investment, but we think this may be an interesting channel to think through and perhaps take into account when the government does monetary fiscal policies that will in some way generate inflation. And we do this properly in a new paper that we just put out on Monday. So we think in a simple macroeconomic model about different policies that the government can do and how do these policies affect investment. So one thing the government can do is try and raise the inflation target, which is just a shorthand of saying the government somehow manages to raise inflation expectations in the long run. Well, that has a very direct mechanical link to investment through the channel that I just talked about. Okay, so in the standard model, this doesn't really matter. So this is the model with flexible discount rates in light blue here. That's the standard New Keynesian model that we use. Long-run inflation is neutral. Who cares? It's just prices, right? But here you actually get a transient investment boom because firms are taking a long time to adjust their discount rates, and as a result, they're increasing their real investment when inflation goes down. It's just this channel in a macro model, basically. There's other things the government can do. They can spend, right? They can just try and put out fiscal policy, which is something that the Biden administration has done recently to a large extent. Well, in a simple model, what happens is the government spends more. That raises the interest rate because capital is more expensive and the Federal Reserve responds to that, and that should lower inflation. That's typically a lower investment, lower investment here in the light blue line. And that's what's typically known as crowd out of investment. So the government comes into the economy, but it crowds out some private sector activity. In the long run, that can be bad because we want private firms to invest and come up with good ideas. But here in the short run, because the government generates inflation, investment actually goes up. And so we get a kind of crowd in of investment. And that's something, this kind of co-movement between government spending, consumption, and investment is something that we see often in the real economy, but we struggle to explain it in models. Perhaps this is a way to kind of get it. Finally, the Monetary Policy Committee spends a lot of time thinking about the short-term monetary policy rate. Now, that still works here in the sense that if interest rates go up, there's a monetary policy shock, so the Fed raises interest rates. That still lowers investment and consumption, but the effect now is much weaker, which means the dark blue line is smaller. The effect is smaller than the light blue line. We actually kind of like this effect as well because we think that in the standard model, these effects are unreasonably big. And so you kind of get dampening of investment responses to interest rates, which we think perhaps makes more sense in light of what the data suggest. OK, so this was the business cycle implications. And now let's think more about the final part that I want to talk about, which is the cost of capital and how do firms get there. So a lot of what I talked about so far was sort of taking as given that firms kind of understand what interest rates do and what the cost of capital is, and then they set their discount rates based on that or deviate in their discount rates from that. Now I want to talk more about how they even get to this cost of capital. And usefully for us, they actually report this cost of capital on these conference calls as well. Now in the long run, you have this stickiness, you have discount rates behaving the way they want, but in the long run, firms do seem to converge toward what they estimate their cost of capital be with their discount rates. So we do think the cost of capital that firms calculate eventually matters because it drives investment. And in particular, it drives which firms get more versus less capital, right? So if say there are two identical firms, both of them have an interest rate of 10%, both of them have a cost of capital of 10%. But now let's say one firm thinks its cost of capital is 1%, and the other firm thinks it's 20%. Well, that's going to matter because in the end, it's the perceptions of firms that determine their discount rates and how much they invest. And so the firm that for some reason thinks it has a low cost of capital is going to be investing much more. It's going to get more capital, even though maybe that shouldn't really be the case if you want to allocate capital efficiently, because they're identical firms. They should get the same amount. OK, so let's see what we find in the data. The problem is the cost of capital is unobserved. So I've told this simple story that it's just interest rates. It's really not. Firms have to think carefully about other types of expected financial returns. In particular, they have to think about how much do our equity holders want to earn from investing into the company, from providing capital to the company. And that's actually a very difficult problem because basically the problem is where stock price is going to go. So there are lots of ways of doing this, and there's a lot of heterogeneity in how firms do this. We think there are better and worse ways. And so what we do in this new approach that we've just put out is to try and think about, well, if we do our best in sort of predicting where stock prices are going to go and where the cost of capital is, to what extent does that diverge for different firms? And we find that it diverges a lot. And the headline finding is that most of the variation in firms' perceived cost of capital across different firms, you cannot justify with any reasonable financial model. So firms are adding a lot of factors into their perceived cost of capital that aren't justified by financial returns. A lot of that is idiosyncratic. Now, you might think ex ante that makes sense because firms should know best what their investors want and what they expect to earn. But it actually turns out that even if you look at what happens eventually at realized returns, most of the variation that firms add makes no sense or is actually negatively correlated with where real returns go. So the wrong firms get more capital. There's a lot of heterogeneity in this. There's an extreme conclusion here, which we think is true, that if you force every firm to just use the same cost of capital, allocation of capital would work better than what they're currently doing, which is everyone trying to figure out their own thing and sort of messing it up to a large extent. Now, what does that mean for the US economy? We have a simple model. It's very stylized, but the idea is just to get a sense of how much would this matter. If you somehow manage to get firms to use the right cost of capital, US productivity in the model would increase by 5 to 10%, which is an insanely big number, right? So that suggests really big returns to try and think about how can we get firms to use the right cost of capital, and more generally, how can we get firms to make the right investment decisions that are in line with financial prices and interest rates. That's it. Discount rates have a life of their own. Firms get the cost of capital wrong. We think there are important implications. We've just put the microdata on the website, so if you're interested in doing some of this yourself, feel free. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present here. I work on industrial policy, and I'm excited to talk to you all about some of the recent and not so recent work I've been doing on industrial policy. But more than that, I'm sort of keen to kind of give you a bigger picture, broader view of what with co-authors we've started calling the new economics of industrial policy. So this, I'm going to use my time here today not to talk about sort of individual specific papers. A lot of the thinking that's gone into sort of the substance here is based on a review paper we've been doing with Nathan Lane and Danny Roderick for the annual review, which is on my website. Okay, so there's a fundamental question across the social sciences, which basically asks, do states have a role to play in shaping the composition of what is produced domestically? You know, should states use their policy levers to mess with relative prices in the economy to make certain activities more attractive than others? Now, this idea that we're going to call industrial policy, this idea has basically been controversial since the birth of modern capitalism. So on one side of the debate, there is a long history of advocacy going back to people like US founding father Alexander Hamilton, later Friedrich List in Germany, later in the 20th century Alice Amsden, who have argued that not only can this type of intervention be beneficial, but that it is actually a necessary feature to, you know, in the settings they were working on, kickstart structural transformation, industrialization, in more contemporary settings, to think more broadly about the developmental role that the state has to play. Now, of course, there's another side of this debate which draws on sort of a long tradition of skepticism about whether this is a good idea. So this idea has been controversial for a long time. Let me show you an example from the early 20th century. So this is a caricature from the US. Here you see sort of the metaphorical infant industry. This is the child, labeled protected privilege. And they're clinging to sort of the high tariff mother or nurse and wailing and screaming. Why? Because they're being offered sort of the bottle of open market competition. And this, I think, I really love this caricature because it kind of really gets to the heart of what one strand of thinking has been about why industrial policy might not be a good idea. If we allow sort of the government to have this role in the economy, where they're going to be sort of picking certain sectors, certain activities to privilege, that is really going to open the door to this type of political capture that is being sort of made fun of here. And really, you know, as I think most of you in this room will be aware, this has been sort of the side of the debate that most of modern economics has sided with. In the last 2 to 3 decades, I think our profession has mostly told policymakers and academics that it is best to stay away from industrial policy. So to give you to give you one example, you know, the Nobel laureate Gary Becko famously quipped that the best industrial policy is none at all. Now, one consequence of this has been that until very recently, industrial policy hasn't really been an active area of research within economics. Now, that is a problem because sitting here in 2024, you know, industrial policy has very much become kind of the signature economic policy of the current US administration. So with policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips and Science for America Act, the Biden administration is really coming out strongly and proudly and espousing sort of a newfound American love for industrial policy. Okay, so my starting point today is going to be sort of a plea to us all that industrial policy is a reality. It's very much a reality in 2024. It's likely always been a reality, but in this day and age, it's really a reality that economics can no longer ignore. And one of the main arguments that I want to make is that I think our profession's kind of strong stances against industrial policy haven't really had an extremely solid base of empirical evidence to argue from. And I think we need less ideological opposition in this field and more careful, what I would call sort of quote unquote mainstream work, using state-of-the-art empirical, structural, theoretical tools that our profession has developed in recent decades. And what I want to sort of showcase to you a little bit today is that the new economics, what we call the new economics of industrial policy, is really an attempt to do just that. Okay, so I have like a heroic agenda for today. I'm going to try to talk about 4 things quickly. What is industrial policy? What is the economic rationale for doing industrial policy? I'm going to argue that we have really vanilla, standard textbook justifications for doing this, which kind of raises the question of, well, if this is so obvious, why have we been so skeptical of it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the serious, well-founded concerns or challenges that face industrial policy. And then, this is like really the heroic part, I want to sort of give you kind of a very broad lens through which to look at what we know. Okay, so one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is how to define industrial policy in some sort of rigorous way. And so the definition that I like to use is that industrial policy is government action that explicitly seeks to transform the structure of the domestic economy, of economic activity, in pursuit of some goal. So this is very much intentional, sort of strategic policy. It is the US deciding that it needs to have advanced semiconductor manufacturing capability. So it is changing relative prices in the economy to funnel resources into that activity with the specific goal of increasing national security, geopolitical goals, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the type of policy that we think about when we think about industrial policy. Now, why is this useful? Because we found that taking this sort of view on industrial policy is actually extremely clarifying when you think about some of the sort of discourse around industrial policy. So industrial policy is not necessarily based on specific policy levers. I think this is where sort of measurement and a lot of previous work has focused for good reason. In most areas of policy, if you study tax policy, if you study minimum wages, you kind of know which policy levers to go to when you want to go out and measure the objects of interest. With industrial policy, it's far more problematic because there's no clear mapping between the policy levers and industrial policy. So to fix ideas, a tariff, canonical tool of industrial policy. A tariff can be an industrial policy, but it also has a variety of other uses. Historically, it has been used to raise fiscal revenue. It's very much the case still in developing countries today. We also know that it is used to manipulate terms of trade. The issue for us then, as sort of people wanting to measure industrial policies, if you go out and you look at a country's tariff schedule, that may tell you very little about a country's industrial policy stance. The problem is compounded, of course, by the fact that many different policy levers can be used for industrial policy purposes. Subsidies, land grants, technology policies, so on and so on. And so the point is that because there's no clear mapping between policy levers and industrial policy, when we've sort of looked at industrial policy through the lens of sort of subsidies or tariffs, it's, I think, led to more confusion than it has been clarifying. I also like this definition because we typically, and often I think in sort of conversation, we think of industrial policy as being something that is only about sectoral targeting. It's about favoring certain sectors and not others. And again, some industrial policy is like that, but some industrial policy is not. Lots of forms of innovation policy are industrial policy. And sort of here again, there's something clarifying about this definition. My personal pet peeve is that we conflate protectionism with industrial policy. And again, of course, there is an overlap, but this mapping is not perfect. And what some of my new work has shown is that actually a lot of contemporary industrial policy is not protectionist at all. Instead, it is trying to use policy tools to get firms to compete in international markets. So on the contrary, it's actually quite outward looking. Okay. I don't want to spend a lot of time here because really I just want to remind you that the justification for industrial policy is just the most boring vanilla stuff that we teach in Econ 101. So this is not different to any other domain in which we think the government may have a role to play. The scope for policy intervention with industrial policy is the existence of a market failure. And the other thing that I want to highlight, I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but these are not sort of obscure, weird market failures that we're talking about. So in the review paper with Lane and Roderick, we sort of give one categorization of the main market failures that justify industrial policy. I'm a trade economist. In spatial urban models, externalities, the idea that there are co-location benefits to firms, this is like baked into all of our workhorse models. These are things that are generally accepted in other fields. So I'm not, when we talk about the justifications for industrial policy, we're not arguing to add new things to the list of market failures. Same for the provision of public goods. We typically think of public goods as being very horizontal, untargeted, think things like national security. And a lot of public good provision is like that, but some of it isn't. One concrete example that very much falls in the domain of industrial policy, and a timely example, is the charging infrastructure that we need to build out if we're serious about the take-up of electric vehicles. And when public good provision is activity specific, and when it is done intentionally to facilitate the net zero transition, for example, that is very much in the domain, again, of industrial policy. Okay, so given these justifications are so widespread and sort of commonly acknowledged, I think, in our field, why has there been so much historical opposition? And I think the easiest way to sort of summarize where a lot of skepticism around industrial policy comes from is the idea that the government failure that is involved with doing industrial policy is just always going to be worse than whatever market failure we seek to correct. In plain English, the cure of government intervention is going to be worse than the disease of the market failure that we're trying to address. Now, this type of government failure sort of comes in two main forms with industrial policy. Both sort of have to do with this standard argument that the government can't pick winners. One is what is known as the information problem. So here the idea is that it's all good and well for us to talk about there being market failures in certain sectors, but market failures, of course, are not things that are super easily observable in the real world. And so when even a benevolent policymaker sort of comes out and wants to do industrial policy, they're just going to have a really hard time of figuring out where market failures actually are in the economy. The second sort of main skepticism around industrial policy concerns political capture. So this goes back to sort of that very first figure I showed you. Here, the idea is that, again, if the government is sort of in the business of prioritizing, favoring certain activities at the expense of others, that is either going to open the door for rent-seeking or lobbying, or it's going to be just sort of code for the government being able to sort of give goodies to well-connected firms, well-connected sectors. Okay, now I don't want to be flippant about these challenges. I think these are very real, very serious kind of challenges, and ones that we know have derailed efforts at industrial policy sometimes in the past. But what I want to say, and I think where sort of a lot of the impetus for my research initially came from as a grad student, is that when you sort of look at sort of the strong views we hold about industrial policy as a profession, it really doesn't rely on kind of a solid foundation of empirical knowledge. And really the skepticism of our profession around industrial policy emerged before the empirical turn in economics. And so what sort of the recent crop of papers that have emerged in the last couple of years have tried to do is they've just taken sort of standard frontier economic tools and investigated these questions with these standard sort of quote unquote mainstream methods. And the picture that's emerging is one that sort of very much, I think, challenges the long-standing consensus in our field around industrial policy, and it challenges this consensus with better measurement. So one of the things that I've been doing in the last couple of years is trying to figure out a way to measure industrial policy that doesn't rely on these policy levers. And what, together with Nathan Lane, Emily Olson, and Veronica Perez, we have done is we've developed sort of a natural language processing approach to measuring industrial policy, where instead of using the policy instruments per se, instead of sort of trying to extract industrial policy from tariffs, subsidies, et cetera, we're using the policy language around policy announcements to figure out which policies have language consistent with the definition of industrial policy that I gave. Yes, I've got 5 minutes. Good, I'm going to do it. It's okay. So why should we measure these things? Well, because where we came at this question actually before sort of industrial policy kind of came roaring back onto the policy scene was that there's so little actually that we know about industrial policy. This idea that industrial policy is protectionist is something that wasn't, again, based on sort of a solid empirical understanding. And so before we really even got into thinking deeply about what should we do about evaluating effects, we really just wanted to sort of understand the contemporary practice of industrial policy. And so some of the things that have emerged from this line of research is that we've found that industrial policy, unsurprisingly and sort of helpful to us confirming that what we're doing looks sensible, we do find that IP is on the rise, but it also never went away. And the thing that was sort of pretty surprising to us ex ante, but I think makes a lot of sense ex post, is that we find that industrial policy is widely practiced in advanced economies, much more so than in poor countries. Most of industrial policy in the global economy today, at least based on our measurement exercise, is conducted in the richest countries. And I can speak a little bit more about that if there are questions. In the interest of time, I just want to show you the extent to which sort of the top quintile of the income distribution dwarfs or dominates the new industrial policies that have been implemented in the last decade. Okay, in my last sort of 3 minutes, I'm going to talk about what the empirical evidence around industrial policy shows in this sort of new line of research. What I want to flag is where we have, I think, pretty solid evidence is based on sort of reduced form empirical effects, which really ask the question of, does industrial policy elicit the types of behavioral responses that are in line with the policymaker's intention? And in sort of 3 different domains that have traditionally, I think, been very controversial in terms of industrial policy, we've actually been surprised to find that the effects are actually not across the board positive, but they're much more consistently positive than we would have imagined. And there seems to be strong evidence, at the very least, that the market failures that justify these interventions are not only very real, but they're potentially quite large. So let me just spend 1 minute on each, and then I'll wrap up. In terms of public R&D, which has been sort of a controversial aspect of industrial policy, we have some evidence that public R&D has positive local effects, and instead of crowding out private investment, it may actually crowd in private investment. We see this with sort of micro public R&D efforts, where the policymaker is really sort of changing incentives on the margin. But we also have some emerging evidence from sort of canonical moonshot efforts where the government really got into the weeds of choosing technologies, choosing places, really getting into the implementation with the World War II R&D effort in the US and the Apollo mission. And sort of the reason we're putting sort of the publication of all these papers is I want to show you that these are not being published in sort of obscure journals. The papers that I'm showing you are all published in sort of the leading journals of our profession, or on their way to being published in the leading journals of our profession. Place-based industrial policy, again, has been sort of, has faced a lot of skepticism. Here the concern is really that if you're picking certain locations, it's really just going to reallocate economic activity from one location to another. It's not really going to do anything in the aggregate. We have a lot of evidence that boosting sort of manufacturing, this type of place-based industrial policy, boosting manufacturing either in sort of distressed regions or in lagging peripheral regions, may actually be pretty beneficial, at least in terms of local effects, but we also have emerging evidence that the aggregate effects may actually be quite substantial too. My favorite paper in this line of research is the US World War II manufacturing push, which is Garin and Rothbaum's paper. There's little evidence of these spillovers that we worry about here. But where we see leakages is actually through multi-plant firms, which kind of suggests maybe ways that we can think about policy trying to design around these challenges. And then the final area, and this is the area in which I started sort of initially working as a grad student and then as sort of an early career researcher, is sort of the controversial and historical infant industry argument. Here as well, I think we actually have a number of papers that look at this. My dissertation looked at the development of French mechanized cotton spinning in early 19th century France. My co-author Nathan Lane looked at sort of a canonical episode of industrial policy in which South Korea was trying to get into heavy chemicals and industry. And in both cases, I think the finding is that the market failures that justify these interventions seem to be pretty big. And with Nathan's job market paper, because there you actually have the policymaker doing the intervention, it also suggests that this can be sort of implemented in the real world outside of the domain of natural experiments. So I know I'm mindful that I'm probably already over time. Let me just conclude. And I don't think that doing industrial policy is easy. But I think that what I would like to see sort of the current revival of industrial policy in the policy arena potentially achieve is to sort of normalize research on industrial policy within the field. And instead of asking whether we should be doing industrial policy, it would be amazing if our research efforts, and for us as academics, we were more focused on thinking about how to do industrial policy well. I think the political economy challenges, the political capture, the information challenges that I alluded to, these are very real. But they're not insurmountable, and they actually have a lot of analogies to other policy domains like fiscal or monetary policy that I'm happy to talk about. Thank you.
One topic that came up, and I think all three of your presentations, was different policy instruments that might be used to target investment. There was the idea of maybe relaxing supply constraints on housing, some unconventional effects of monetary policy, maybe R&D subsidies. And so I'd be interested to hear, whether you think that there's sort of one right policy lever, whether there's many overlapping frictions and we should be doing many overlapping policies, or how you think about the policy space broadly. Let me throw two more out and then you can sort of pick and choose. I started by talking about the decline in interest rates over the last 20 years. Of course, as some of you mentioned, they've gone back up. Joe, you already touched a little bit on, but I'd like to ask more, should we expect real rates to stay elevated? And does that mean maybe we should expect to see sort of similarly slow responses of investment to the increase in interest rates in a similar way to how we saw a slow, if little if any, response to interest rates falling before? Should we expect symmetry there? So first on policy levers, second on rising interest rates, third, I find it fascinating as mostly an economic theorist to be on a panel with people who are doing such great work in macroeconomics, really using very granular data. And so I just wanted to ask you, what you think that reflects, where you think the literature is going, and what questions you hope, to shed light on with these new approaches.
So do you want to go first? Sure, absolutely. So I guess the question that I think we have a most direct answer to is the outlook of interest rates. And of course, it's really difficult to know for sure. I mean, these are things that financial markets spend a lot of time trying to forecast. But our estimates do suggest, with respect to this debate, that interest rates in the long term don't seem so likely to rise. Of course, this could change. So as economists, we're always hesitant to make predictions. But that's what it seems like for now, based on our very long-term estimates. Of course, these things could change. So if we have a wave of AI-related growth, for example, in the 2020s, which is something Governor Cook alluded to yesterday, that's the kind of thing that you would expect upward pressure on interest rates. But tentatively, the way that valuations were looking before the pandemic does seem like it's here to stay. To take one of your other questions quickly, John, we do find that one of the key determinants shaping long-term asset price movements is inelastic housing supply, at least in the UK. To my mind, one of the key questions is to what extent similar forces apply to other assets, to other forms of capital, not just housing. I think it's quite well known, we're not the first to point out, that housing is inelastic in many countries, and something is similar is going on in the United States, and that's something that we're currently working on, and we're hoping to have more work on this soon. What is not clear to us yet is the analogy between what we're finding for housing and for other kinds of assets, for physical capital. Because of course there has been this investment slowdown, not just in home building, but also for other kinds of investment. And for us, that's sort of what this conference is about, and that seems like the real frontier, because the policies through which one could make housing sort of overcome these constraints are fairly obvious, even if they're difficult. Liberalize planning reforms, allow more building. What is not clear is the extent to which this analogy applies to physical investment of other kinds, and that's where we think the sort of frontier is for future research. Thanks, John.
Yeah. So let me try to answer the question about policy space and policy levers. I think I've always believed that. Okay. So I think that the more you need to turn the microphone on? No, I'm good. Okay. So in terms of the policy space, I think my short answer, and something that I've come to believe increasingly strongly over time, is that there is no sort of one-size-fits-all policy. That's true sort of across countries, and I think it's also true within countries. I think one of the big things that I've been recently thinking about with Nathan Lane, and we're just about to put a paper out on the political economy of industrial policy, in which we really try to think seriously about some of these criticisms. One of the things that I think is important in the policy space to be very mindful of and to think strategically about is what are the sets of policies that are sort of politically feasible, and what are the sets of policies that set us up for sort of long-term success. So let me give you one concrete example that we have in this paper that we're about to put out, in which we're looking at climate policy. And of course, we know that an important climate policy package should involve carbon pricing. Famously, the US has been unable to pass carbon pricing legislation. And now there is a question of how we should think about sort of the Inflation Reduction Act. It has a lot of green industrial policy instruments. One way of thinking about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is very much actually in line with political science thinking around this, is that these are the set of policies that are feasible, that are politically feasible in the current environment. This is what could be passed, but there's also something a lot more subtle here, which has been shown in sort of the European context. It's also been shown in China and South Korea, that when you put in place green industrial policies, because you're creating sort of political constituencies for renewables, because you are sort of you're funding projects in Republican districts that are traditionally hostile to climate policy, you're actually sort of sowing the seeds for being able to do the aggressive carbon pricing policy that you may need to do in the future, one. And two, you're also sort of sowing the seeds for the political longevity of any climate policy to last beyond the current administration. So I think the way that I think about the policy space is in sort of a very pragmatic way. You know, there's an important role to play for thinking about, you know, what is the first best response, what is economically efficient, but then we also need to sort of think through the lens of what modern political economy teaches us to think about the current landscape as the outcome of a political equilibrium in which politicians want to stay in power, in which there's a dynamic of power in which all these things are endogenously arising and in which we're trying to sort of maintain the longevity of any policy. So I've given like a super long answer, so I won't take any. I have thoughts on the granular data, but I'll let Kilian say something.
All right, I'll do the data. I think you're right that there's been a change in economics toward people using more data, using larger data. I think in large part that's just driven by technology. We're now able to do this much more easily than we were before. I would still say that perhaps there's been a bit of a backlash in the sense that certainly in macrofinance, but also in other fields, we realize that just pure data isn't good enough and we want to think conceptually. And there's two ways to think conceptually. One is to write down a model and then test that model very formally using data. The other way around is to just collect some data and then try and figure out how you need to tweak your existing models to kind of get closer to reality and what people actually do. I suppose the work that I presented today was more in the second line of thought. I think, in fact, much of research nowadays probably works in the second line, that we have some facts that we didn't know about before and that people are now trying to explain using new models. I think there's a huge danger of trying to leave the conceptualizing completely arbitrary and not having any formal frameworks. I think it's tempting because it allows you to jump to conclusions very quickly, but I think it makes the discourse very difficult. It makes it very difficult to generalize and extrapolate to different policy settings. So I think there's a good vibe in the profession right now, people trying to do both, and may it continue.
All right, so with that, let's open to the floor to questions. So if folks just want to raise their hand, we'll take a handful and then let the panelists answer some.
This question is addressed primarily to Dr. Huber. I pose a question and a suggestion. Giving a bit of my background, I've been active in private equity and venture capital, and I've sat on many investment committee meetings. And in particular, I want to address this phrase, idiosyncratic factors, in your presentation, is that I like to mention three so-called idiosyncratic factors from my experience. One is the judgment of the character of the CEO of the firm they're going to invest in, and that is not easily quantifiable. But there are two others. One is the possession of intellectual property, and the second, and the third one is the barrier to entry in that industry. And I think the possession of intellectual property and barrier to entry are to some extent quantifiable. So that's my first comment. My second comment is this: is that private equity and venture capital firms, when they raise money, in their offering memorandum, there's usually something called hurdle rate. And basically what it means is that only if the investment they make exceed hurdle rate can the partners of those firms start drawing carried interest, where's really where the upside is. And in my experience, this hurdle rate is a very good proxy for their judgment as to the cost of capital of their investors. For example, if they try to get an investment from the Princeton endowment, like the hurdle rate. By the way, this bit also reinforces your comment, is that the cost of capital is relatively sticky. The hurdle rate I generally see is about 8%, plus or minus 2%, and this is their judgment as to what is the cutoff for the institutional investors, like Princeton endowment, what their capital is. So that perhaps, if you're going to do further research in this area, you may want to find out what is the hurdle rate for private equity firms and venture capital firms, because that, in my mind, is a very good proxy for their judgment of cost of capital.
Thank you. In the second row, you had a question?
No, thank you. So a question, excellent presentations for, Yes, for Réka and for Kilian. So, Réka, I think that just the work that you're doing to really separate industrial policy, that it's not a tariff, but I was wondering if you could maybe highlight where you think industrial policy, you talked about ones where they could be more effective, but where have they really not succeeded? And then maybe just the link, Kilian, to how you look at industrial policy and the implications for inflation and longer term yields, because there is a debate going on that one reason that you could have more volatile cycles, higher inflation, higher cost of capital is related to industrial policy. So just when industrial policy fails, why does it fail? And how are you linking it to the macro longer term effects?
Let's try to take Xavier, Moritz, and then we'll pause and answer some and come to the other side of the room.
Yeah, so about industrial policy, so it's a very thank you. It's a very tempting prospect if it's possible. But the obvious question is, okay, some of the papers you cite, like the QJ, they say, okay, let's look at what happened in Korea, and we know exports to have done wonderfully in Korea. So you can write your paper with econometrics and shift shares and all that. But we know the answer, which is great. But if you had done the same thing in Nigeria or in Egypt, or in I don't know, France in steel, and you know it's going to be terrible. So I think there's a huge selection bias on the side of the author who kind of knows the macro, the rough sign of the outcome. Then you do 3 years of work. So I think we need to have much more work all around the world before declaring, because 3 papers have been published that it works so well. Anyway. And for Kilian now, so I love this research. I think it's very, very convincing. But now you say, the firms will have a constant nominal rate. But if inflation goes up, so their real rate is going to fall by 1%. But if firms are so boundedly rational, maybe the spreadsheet where they project cash flows, even if inflation is 1% higher, they will not project cash flows to be nominal 1% higher, probably not. So I think it's worth checking before jumping to monetary policy.
I do. I have a lot.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, Xavier, this was my question to you as well, Réka, so you just took it away, but I totally found it. First of all, I wanted to thank you for these excellent presentations. I really learned a lot. It was great fun to listen. Réka, one question to you, and really adding to what's been said, is state capacity seems to be a very central object here in the room. And some states seem to be able to do this, and that might be change even over time with successful examples, not so successful examples. So how do we think about state capacity, and what do we know from a research point of view? I know there's been a lot of historical stuff, but is there more recent work? And I guess the other question is a little bit also in that direction. Can we aggregate things a little bit more up to the macro level? I mean, you have these like very nicely and well-identified micro examples. It worked here, and the moonshot worked. People landed on the moon. At least I believe that. But but is that like how do we think about it from the macro level? And if I may, Joe, to you, question on the real estate side. I mean, I think this is fantastic and a great really idea to tease out these long-term rates. On the other hand, it is a market that we know is not. Let's say it populated by professionals, but by households that are subject to all kinds of mood swings and all kinds of behaviors that we from other work know might be not the best. They're also credit constrained quite often, and a lot of what you observe is mortgage financed. So wouldn't it be logical to have some kind of decline on these rates when mortgage rates go down and people use debt? I mean, I just want to tease you a little bit on that. And very last point, if I may, is the regional stuff. I think we know from other research that there are large differences in risk premia across regions in a single country. To go to some remote place, it's very undiversified. Housing there is risky. New York is diversified and risk premia low. So how does that add up to how does it in fact affect your study? But thanks again.
Let's take just a few minutes and we'll do another round.
Do you have a preference for the order?
Go ahead.
All right. Thank you for the question with the private equity background. I mean, it's always really nice to hear stories from practitioners that some of the patterns we find are actually true in the real world. I think I agree with everything you said. I think we can actually measure manager characteristics relatively well too. We're working on that. So one interesting question is it a correct characteristic of the firm or of the individual running the firm, to what extent the hurdle rate deviates from the cost of capital. So that's something that we're trying to do right now. We're also trying to understand whether private equity firms and other financial firms are doing this differently. And in fact, it seems like they have lower wedges and seem a little bit more sophisticated in how they implement this, consistent with kind of an educational background story playing a role here. Xavier, quickly to your thing. So yeah, they are inconsistent in the sense they do seem to raise their cash flow forecasts, in fact, raise their prices when expected inflation goes up. There's a question where this comes from. So I don't think the explanation for the patterns I've documented is sheer stupidity, that they don't know what they're doing. But I think they're trying to solve complicated problems. And one theory is that a stable and sticky discount rate serves as a kind of a commitment device, that you're not going to do crazy empire-building stories, and makes investors happy, even though you're leaving some potentially positive NPV projects on the table. We're working on trying to microfinance some of these, but I think that would be consistent with what you're saying.
Okay, I'll try. Yes, I'll try to keep it short. So thank you very much for the questions. So let me just put two big caveats out there. Of course, I am not saying that industrial policy will always work, and I don't want to come across as sort of declaring victory. I think when I started out as a PhD student, and my sense of the field for a time has been that sort of the consensus is that this can't work. So the burden of proof has been like, can you show me examples where actually this has been successful? And it's interesting to hear you say, well, of course we know that industrial policy was successful in South Korea. You don't have to do like 3 years of work to that. Just last year, famous economists, you can Google them, in the IMF annual review or wherever, made the point that the HCI effort in Korea, which is the subject of Nathan's paper, was a disaster. So I think more broadly, I think the consensus in the 1990s and the research that was done in the 1990s made the case, and this was sort of the profession sort of maintained hypothesis, that the East Asia miracle happened either despite industrial policy being used, or it succeeded despite industrial policy being used. So I think if you tell me, well, of course we know that industrial policy can succeed, I say great, because now we're in the realm of how, not in the realm of whether. Like we've managed to shift the terms of the debate, and if that's true, like I'm happy. In terms of thinking about how and why industrial policy hasn't succeeded, I mean, I think this is where the big questions lie, although I don't think that there's going to be some like secret sauce that we're going to discover, that if you apply this sort of heuristic and target this type of sector in this type of economy with this type of policy lever, then you've got sort of the magic recipe. I think it's both more complicated and less complicated than that. So, to the question of like which policy instruments have succeeded, I think we can come up with cases for success for all policy instruments. So import substituting industrialization gets a very bad rap because it did lead to some disastrous outcomes, but actually not because, in many cases, it wasn't because tariff protection is inherently sort of an inferior policy. It was because of the political economy, that once it became clear that either the sector wasn't competitive, protection couldn't be removed, or that the economy, once sort of ISI had done what it could do and they needed to open the economy up and get the firms to compete in international markets, the policymakers couldn't do that step. So it's less well known, but Taiwan, South Korea, they all started doing ISI in the 50s and 60s, and then transformed into the more export-oriented growth miracle that we see. And ISI, at least qualitatively, seemed to do some good things. Latin America also started with ISI and then remained stuck there, basically indefinitely. We have a case study in the paper that we're about to release, in which we talk about why Thailand tried to adopt sort of the secret East Asia source, and they couldn't do it because the political situation just didn't support export-oriented industrial policy. There were powerful political interests for maintaining a strong currency. They couldn't devalue the way they needed to, and the beneficiaries of the ISI system, of the import substituting system, were politically too powerful. So I think actually this is why Nathan and I have been really moving into more and more the political economy arena, because the message of the paper that we're about to release is really that industrial policy has a shot of succeeding when it is working within the current political constraints. That could be doing tariff protection, that could be small export-oriented policy, but it has to be something that is sort of acceptable and viable within the current political situation. Moritz, to your point about state capacity, that is the second theme in our paper, and I know I'm talking way too long, so I'll just give you the 20-second version. We know from modern political economy that state capacity is kind of both a stock but something you invest in. And what we see with sort of almost every successful industrial policy episode is that there are massive investments in state capacity happening simultaneously. So I think it's an empirical question, one where we need more research, whether you can start from like really low levels of state capacity and build up. But in South Korea, again, it's a great example because when Park Chung-hee came into power, South Korea was a mess. Like it was sort of, ex post we say, of course, South Korea did it, but South Korea was as poor as sub-Saharan African countries were at the time. They had a terribly politically corrupt system that Park Chung-hee came into. And so, the state capacity there was not something that was given, it was something that was created. And so again, it's endogenous. Like, why did Park Chung-hee have the incentives to do this? If you have North Korea breathing down your neck, maybe your incentives are different than if you're Nigerian, you're sitting on sort of a lot of oil revenue. So I don't think we need to invent. These are themes that are well known to you all. I don't think we need to invent the wheel when we think about the political economy of industrial policy. We need to take best practices and insights from thinking about political commitment, political credibility, timing consistency, and monetary policy, for example. Think about how we apply that to the practice of industrial policy. So I'm sorry, I've spoken way too long.
That's totally fine. So let me just pick up on something, Moritz, that you mentioned. So what were we doing here? We're looking at this specific asset, which is UK housing, and we're trying to sell these quite general implications about yields more broadly around the world looking forward. So how can we do that? Obviously, it's something I want to hedge and say, yes, it is a specific asset. It's not all assets, and that's something that you should use to take a grain of salt when you look at our results. But actually, in two ways, we do think our results sort of generalize in really interesting ways. The first is that, remarkably, up until this recent rise in yields, if you plot our yield series and you plot its decline, it aligns remarkably well with several other yields. So here I'm thinking US, UK long-term yields, and that suggests that there is some kind of signal there. It's not just certain, maybe unsophisticated investors in the real estate market, rather the sort of market forces through which we expect that the yields on various assets sort of equilibrate in the long run do seem to be operating. And it's not obvious that they would, but when we start to look at other data, it's consistent. And then the second thing that Moritz, you picked up on, which is of course really central to us, and especially central to Artif in his earlier work, is that, well, housing is very different. There are these booms, there are these busts. There's all this issue with mortgage financing, how that varies over the cycle, particularly in the early 2000s is a leading case. And we think precisely one advantage of what we're doing is we have a measure of housing valuations that looks through some of these booms and busts in housing to the extent they're in the short run. One thing that we were really excited about, we were actually looking at this just a few days ago, is if you plot our measure of housing valuations and you compare them to current housing valuations, so current rent price ratios and so on, what you see is that after 2010, our measure and this sort of current measure track each other very well. But prior to 2010, so during this period of this big boom in global house prices in both the US and the UK and around the world, the two measures diverge very sharply. So sort of current housing valuations went crazy, as we know from that earlier experience. But our measure that's supposed to look through temporary booms and busts in house prices is actually relatively stable. As that seems like another payoff of what we're doing, which is to say that, if you're a policymaker, you might worry, okay, there's all of this froth and volatility in housing markets that could lead to big, medium, and short-term swings in house market prices. Well, we have a measure that, to some extent, by design, is supposed to look through them. Therefore, it can give some sense of when house prices might be diverging in the short run from what is the sort of long-run idea of the economy. And so that's sort of, hopefully, directly speaking to some of the issues about housing.
We just have a few minutes. Let me take two questions from Mitch.
Okay. First of all, it's more of a comment than a question, but do you define what a market failure is? Because in today's world, that's pretty a politicized term. in my view. I don't think there's necessarily a neutral notion of what a market failure is anymore. That's question number one. Question number two, do you consider when you look at the United States, which is a federal system where ultimately people could vote with their feet, in other words, 50 different experiments going on for human, physical, financial capital, right? And then you have an overlay of a national government. Have you considered an industrial policy at the national government level laden with accumulated strings attached to those grants? So you may have an industrial policy that has a purpose, but when you add on all the strings that have accumulated over the years and never get eliminated, including, for example, Davis-Bacon wages, which is really originated as a racist policy from the 30s, do you really accomplish what you're trying to achieve in the first place? And do you undermine what makes this country particularly work, which is the federal system and the competition between the states, because you're essentially, with these huge programs, federalizing state and local law?
You have a question for Dr. Huber. Do you include mergers and acquisitions in your investment calculations?
Okay, let's just answer those. The panel will be here after. We're happy to take more questions.
Oh, okay. So to the question about market failure, no, I disagree in the regard that I think we agree on what a market failure is. There are instances in which the market is not delivering efficient outcomes. I think what you're alluding to is sort of the information challenge is, everyone is now claiming there's a market failure in their sector. There's a reason why the market is not producing desirable outcomes here. This is why we need a government intervention. I think we all agree what a market failure is. The challenge is that, no one can sort of bring some sort of verified paper that says, like, I've been certified as a market failure activity. Now please give me my support. I think the question is, your question speaks more to the information challenge. I'm not sure I fully understood the competition.
You have a national policy, a national industrial policy in a federal system.
Can you? Is that the question?
And coincided with that policy, you have a legacy of strings that will attach to that policy that may or may not support that policy and have the effect of federalizing state and local law. Do you really, and undermining our federal system, you have to weigh the benefits of that industrial policy versus undermining what makes this country tick?
I mean, I think the short answer that I can give you is this goes to the heart of our political feasibility sort of statement, in which you have to think about implementing policy not in sort of your desired world, in which this is like the one market failure and the one sort of policy instrument that you're using, but you're operating in the messy reality of this system. I'm not like an advocate for Bidenomics, and I'm not on their payroll, so I'm like the academic who's like watching them, looking at what they do. I think they're making sort of reasonable decisions. Of course, it's a risky proposition what they're doing, but I think it's also one that the counterfactual is to do nothing. And given that that's the counterfactual, I'm not sure that I don't have a strong belief that the industrial policy that they're doing is necessarily worse.
So yes, we look at mergers and acquisitions in two ways. One is that some companies actually have separate discount rates that apply to mergers and acquisitions relative to other types of projects. And those, on average, tend to be a bit lower, but they behave over time in a similar way. And when you look at the evolution of discount rates of a firm, that's the second way we look at mergers. That also influences the size of the expansion. So if you want to buy another company, companies think about it in terms of discount rates. If they change their discount rate, that changes to what extent they engage in mergers and acquisitions.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.